just to give you a sense of what's going on here, at this point, I can see how many answers have come in, but I don't know what the answers are yet. So when the poll is finished, I'll be able to see what people have been writing. You didn't know that I was going to get you all to work first thing in the morning. These are not tests, by the way, they're just illustrative things so that when I talk about them, you'll see why I think they're interesting. Okay, so there's a good number of answers coming in. Again, I think answers are still coming in, but I'm going to move on to the next slide. Ah, now I can see the answers. Okay, so I'll let you have a look at, you can see the answers now as well, can you? Or can you not?
I'm sorry, but if I'm not mistaken, we can't see them right now.
Ah, okay, I will show them to you soon, once we get through all of them. Okay, you can see this is why I pretended not to be able to share earlier, because I wanted to see how you would respond if I said, I can't see how to share. Maybe you're beginning to guess that I'm getting some informal evidence about pragmatics by how you're answering these questions. And of course, I got a little bit, I was very cheeky to Lucia by asking the question when saying this when I actually did know how to share. Okay, just for reasons of time, I'm going to move on, even though I know some of you are still about to type something. Great, there are some interesting answers for that one. And then I believe this is my last question for now. And I'm assuming some of you will think, how on earth would I know? But just put in anything that you think about what this person might mean. You can write, I don't know, of course. Okay, so I'm having a look. Great, so those answers are what I would expect, because of course, that is a question that depends on knowing that word tigged. And without any context, I can't see how any of you would know what tigged would mean. Okay. Okay, sorry, I was taking a minute because I was struggling to get to the point where I could close that presentation. Okay, so now I'm back to talking to you and not making you work so much, but I'm going to talk about your responses in a second. You're all still seeing my PowerPoint, right? So you can see this is the this session slide. So what I'm going to do in the next, I suppose, about an hour, a bit less than that, is I'm going to talk about some ideas about pragmatics. And in particular, I want to talk about pragmatics understood as mind reading. And my students know that every time they see inverted commas on a slide, I ask them, why are those inverted commas there? And in this case, they're there because mind reading could be understood in different ways. It doesn't mean anything magic or like some kind of trick that somebody does on a stage when they say, I know what you're thinking and so on. There's a different sense of mind reading. And I'm going to say something about how current approaches to pragmatics are different from earlier ones. And I'm going to say some stuff about how ideas from pragmatics can be investigated and applied. So the first question I just asked you just now was, are some of these squares blue? And I wonder if I stop sharing this, because what we've got is we've got the question, are some of these squares blue? The question, what does this mean? The question, what does this mean? And the question, what does this mean? And I think what I will do, I hope it will work, because I'm a bit worried about my network here, but I'm going to try to share the web page that will show you the results of what you said when I asked you these questions. So this is the site, Menti. Are you all seeing this now, the web page that says to answer Billy's questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So any of you who are teachers, that I found this a really useful tool. In seminars, you can ask questions, and for different kinds of questions, you might be showing the results as they come in. So I'm going to click on view results here, and I will show you what you said to my different questions. This is where I suddenly don't know how to look at the results. Here we go. I did this yesterday and now I'm not managing it very well. Maybe I'm downloading. Okay. Okay, this was the question about how much you know about pragmatics. My network is struggling, so it's taking a while. Okay, can you see that? Can you see the results, the bar chart? Yeah, good. Okay, so we've got some people saying they know quite a lot as a student or researcher, a majority saying a bit, and some people saying very little or never heard of it. So that makes me happy because I hope that means I'm pitching this around where I want to pitch it. Okay, do you agree with the statement that some of these squares are blue? And you can see that the majority of answers have gone somewhere in the middle. So not many of you are saying, yes, you completely agree that some of these squares are blue. And some of you are saying that you disagree that some of these squares are blue. Okay, and I just want you to think for a minute. Are any of the squares blue?
Of course they are.
Yeah, all of them are, right? So if it's not true that some of the squares are blue, then it must be that none of them are blue, mustn't it? Because if at least one square is blue, then some of them are blue. So there's a kind of logically interesting thing about this, isn't there? That logically speaking, if at least one square is blue, it's true that some of them are blue. In fact, not only are some of them blue, they're all blue. It's even stronger than that some of them are blue, they're all blue. But when we say things like some of these squares are blue, we don't tend to think that that's an appropriate thing to say when all of the squares are blue. So I want you to think a bit about why would that be? So if I just give you a slightly different text here, imagine that I have been teaching very badly and all of my students keep failing my exams at the end of the semester. And somebody says to me, you're in trouble, you know, Billy, you might even lose your job unless some of your students pass the exam. If all of the students pass the exam, I'll be quite happy because some of them have passed. So all of the squares are blue is consistent with some of them are blue. So it actually is true that some of these squares are blue. But we tend to think, oh, there's something a bit odd about that. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that one in a minute as well. And then the next question. Okay, was the pointing one. And so some of you have said it that this is pointing. Somebody obviously typed and it submitted too late and went into the wrong slide. All of them are blue, not just some of them. Oh no, hang on. I'm a bit confused now. Yeah. The child knows what its wants, mom not so much. The child is pointing to something, perhaps reaching out to grab it. The child wants to play with the plushies on the shelves. Kid pointing at toy he or she wants to play with. Okay, so those are very good answers, and that's the kind of things that I would say on that one. And then this is the one about I can't see how to share. Not knowing how to share to get 10. Oh, that's maybe the pointy one. It means I don't know where the share button is. I need help, an indirect request for help or instructions, and so on. So some of your answers are kind of saying that I'm stating that I don't know how to share, but some of them are thinking I'm saying a bit more than that. I'm actually asking for some help. And Lucia's response showed she took it in that kind of way, because she started looking, okay, where is the share button? I need to tell Billy where the share button is. So I'm sorry, Lucia, if that stressed you out a bit when I asked you that. And then I think this is the last one. This is the one that's a bit of a cheat. Oh no, I see, we're still on that one. Okay, I think what I'm going to do, just for speed, I'm not going to bother with I've been tigged, because it will be better for me to say some stuff about that one. So I'm now going to go back to my PowerPoint. Find the right one. I seem to have come back to the first slide. Okay. So what I want to suggest now is that what these things have got in common. So a child is pointing, some squares that are blue, or all of them are, somebody saying I can't see how to share, is that they have to do with mind reading. And what I mean by mind reading is they involve people trying to think about what's going on in the minds of other people. So when that child is pointing, your answer showed that you were thinking about what the kid was trying to do, what the kid was thinking or trying to get the adult to think, pointing at the thing it's interested in, and so on. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this now in relation to mind reading. The reason I think that people will think that when somebody says some of the squares are blue, it's a bit odd if they're all blue, is because they are thinking along the lines of, if all of these squares were blue, the speaker would have said that they're all blue. Does that make sense? I'm looking at the people in the classroom because you're the ones whose faces I can see. So I'm really pleased that I can see you, so I can see people nodding. So that's a kind of mind reading. Somebody says some of the squares are blue. You don't just think the logical thing that some of them are blue and leave it open that maybe all of them are or not. You think they must think that they're not all blue. So there's mind reading going on from the point of view of the person understanding the utterance. And I would suggest there's also mind reading going on from the point of view of the speaker. So if some of the squares are blue, but not all of them are, the speaker will think, well, I don't need to say that not all of them are blue. I can just say some of the squares are blue, and I can trust the person I'm speaking to understand they can't all be blue, because they would have said all of the squares are blue if they're all blue. I hope that makes some kind of sense. And it's that kind of assumption, which is a really common one in pragmatics, that we assume explains why when somebody says some, you tend to think not all. And then here, I would say the grown-up here will be mind reading what the child is doing. So the child is pointing towards toys, and the grown-up will be thinking something like, oh, she's pointing at that because she wants me to notice it. And we all know that with kids, we're always trying to make assumptions about what they're doing and why. We are reading their minds. In fact, I sent a message to somebody yesterday who recently had a baby. Not that recently, because I only heard about it a bit late, but she replied and said, we're all getting on really well, and we're getting lots of social smiling. So social smiling, I take that to mean we all know that babies smile. So a baby who's a day old might smile, but nobody will think that smile means the baby's happy. But at a certain stage, babies will smile because you do something that amuses them, or because they're happy to see you, and that becomes social smiling. So again, we're mind reading what's going on in the mind of the baby. Now, here's a question for you. What's going on in the mind of the baby? How do we know what's going on in the mind of the baby? It's interesting, isn't it? Because the baby can't speak and say, yes, I want that toy. And so it's interesting to think about, when do babies start pointing and what does it mean? And we assume that babies are actually mind reading from a very young age. I'm going to mention some research on these things in a minute. Somebody says, I can't see how to share. What I would suggest is you can interpret that as this person just letting you know that they don't know how to share. But if you do, you probably will think something else follows from it. So if in a different context I said, I always get into trouble when I'm on Zoom, I can never see how to share, then the main thing is to say that I don't know how to do that, and then it's a problem. But in the context in which I said it today, it's often going to be understood as, and therefore, I would like you to help me to share, to see how to share. Okay, and then we'll have a similar kind of assumption going on. What's going on in the mind of the person who says, I can't see how to share? So you might think, well, why did Billy not say, please tell me where the share button is? Why did I say I can't see how to share? And of course, it's a cheat because I did it as an example. But in an everyday context where it really happens, we'd assume it's because it would be a bit impolite just to say to somebody, tell me how to share. It's more polite to say something indirect. And that was in one of the answers on the website. Okay, so all of these things I'm suggesting involve a kind of mind reading, in which we're trying to think about, what will people think if I say something this way? And we're trying to think, what did somebody else mean by the way they said something? And I'm hoping that you agree with me that there is that kind of mind reading going on in lots of interaction. Of course, it's going on right now. I'm imagining the minds of all of you and trying to assess whether you've understood what I'm saying and whether you find it interesting and whether I should say something different and so on. And you're trying to understand what I mean by things. And I want to mention another kind of mind reading now. So I don't know, has anybody heard of the Sally Ann task, which this image is about? Okay. Did somebody say something? Okay. There's a little video I'm going to show you part of now. Oops. Sorry, I'm sharing a different thing again. I'm going back to the internet. Okay, this Sally Ann task is something that people do to investigate how children think about people's minds. I'm going to play this clip.
What do you think's inside this box? Have a look inside. Oh, well, let me have a go, shall I? You ready? Say go. Go. What's in there? What's that?
Pencils.
Oh, right. Should we put them back in the box? We put the lid on. Now, can you remember what's inside the box?
Pencils.
And what did you think was in the box? Did you? Now I'm going to show this box to Jay in a minute. What will Jay think is in the box? See? Good.
Okay, can I just check? Could you all hear that as well as see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So you can see that what's going on there with this young child is they expected Smarties to be in the box. When the box is opened, they see that there are pencils in the box. But then when you ask them, what did you think was in the box before we opened it? They say pencils. And when you say to them, what will somebody else think is in the box when they come up to the box? They say pencils. And that suggests that they're not separating out what other people think from what they themselves think. And this has been called theory of mind. The idea that all of us are thinking about the minds of other people, but when kids are very young, they don't do that so much. And later in this video, I'll just see if I can find the bit. We see a different kid. I'm not sure if this kid is older, because it's around when kids are about 4 that they change how they perform on these tasks. Just remember, it's a slightly different task. Okay. So the Sally Ann task is a slightly different task, which I think starts about here. Okay, I'm going to show you the kid who performs differently on it rather than this same kid.
But for another child, Connor, the outcome is somewhat different.
Sally comes in to find her marble. Where will Sally look for her marble? And where was the marble in the beginning? Sit.
Sorry, I realize I need to show you the other version, or you won't know what the options are here. Sorry, I'm going back in time again. I'm so bad with technology.
Comes in with the marble.
Okay, so Sally's coming in with a marble.
Puts her marble into the basket. He goes out. Anne comes, gets the marble. She puts the marble in the box. Here comes Sally. Here comes Sally. Now, where will Sally look for the marble? You got it for her! Hooray!
But for another child, Connor, the outcome is somewhat different.
Sally comes in to find her marble. Where will Sally look for her marble? And where was the marble in the beginning? Sit. Good. Should we look for the marble now? Where did you say the marble is? Have a look. Up. Sit. Good. Joy of this procedure.
Okay, so I'm not sure how completely clear that was, but what I think it shows, just get to the right PowerPoint again. Is that one of the things that we do when we're mind reading is we think about the minds of other people and how they will be different from our own minds. And so the first kid in this experiment, when they see Sally put her marble in a basket and then go out of the room, and then they see Anne move the marble into a box, when they're asked where will Sally think the marble is now, they think she will somehow know where it actually is, rather than imagining the mind of somebody who wasn't in the room when it got moved. Whereas the other kid, maybe because he's a little bit older or maybe he's just a bit different, is able to think, okay, that person wasn't there when the marble was moved, so they're going to think it's still in the original place. Now there are a lot of issues around this task and what's going on. And just to give you a hint at it, maybe the first kid who gets the marble and gives it to Sally isn't pausing to think about what Sally is thinking and is focusing instead on what Sally wants, which is the marble, and is just giving Sally the marble because she wants to be helpful. However, the assumption is that one of the things that develops as we grow up is our ability to imagine the minds of other people. And that's a very general thing. And it seems to be very important in pragmatics, because as people try to work out things like, what did somebody mean by saying, I can't see how to share? You're imagining my mind and thinking what I'm trying to communicate to you. Okay, I'm mentioning a few bits of research on the way here, rather than putting a bunch of references at the end. And this is just one example of research that has to do with pointing, because the pointing thing has to do with ideas about people's minds as well. And what this study showed, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about pointing now. Pointing is something, we all know that kids don't all develop at exactly the same times, but they kind of develop in the same order. At around 8 months old, children can understand pointing. So when somebody points at something, they understand that that person is trying to draw their attention to it and establish joint attention. So we're both looking at the same thing. From around 11 months, children start pointing, and they point in order to communicate something. And one of the things that's interesting that this study shows, Michael Tomasello is one of the authors of this paper, and he's very well known for his work on the kinds of things that infants do before they're speaking. So before they're able to use language, before they get to the one word stage, how they do things that are communicative. And in this study, one of the things that we discover about kids when they're pointing is they sometimes point to things that aren't there. So just randomly, I've got a candle on my table here. I didn't put it here in advance thinking of this, but it just happens to be here. If a kid is in this room, they might point to that candle to draw attention to it. If the candle then gets taken out of the room and I'm here with that kid, they might point to where the candle was in order to make me think about the candle. And what this study shows is that children are much more likely to point to the absence of something if they're with somebody who was there when it was there before. So if one of you magically got teleported into this room now, that child would not point to where the candle used to be, because they're somehow recognizing that you weren't here. And so this seems really significant, because it's suggesting that children are not only communicating, they're actually keeping track of who's aware of which things. So even though we say, oh, that theory of mind thing doesn't develop till they're 4, by the time they're 1, kids are keeping track of things like, you were in the room when that was here, so you'll be aware when I point of what I'm talking about. The next slide is about something called an object choice task, which is another thing that infants do before they're speaking. And this is a critical article about the object choice task, which is often used to see whether animals perform similarly to humans. And I've got a little image to show it. So if there are 2 tumblers upside down on a table and you're unsure which one to turn over, and somebody points to one of them, you're likely to turn over that one. This is done in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's pointing, sometimes it's touching. There might be 2 boxes and I put my hand on one of them. Young children will open the box that I touch or turn over the tumbler that I point to, but chimps don't seem to do this. And this critical study on this is saying that maybe it's the nature of the task rather than the fact that they can't make those kinds of inferences. But the reason I'm mentioning it now is, again, to show very, very young infants, before they're using language, think about the minds of other people and they do mind reading. And the next one that relates to the first question I asked you is about sum and all. And this is a very well-known study by Ira Novak, in which he showed, the title there says, when children are more logical than adults. You ask a young child something like, what do you think about the utterance, some of these squares are blue, when they're all blue? And young kids will think that's completely fine. I'm exaggerating, because it's, not everybody performs exactly the same way in an experiment, but many more younger children will accept something like some when in fact the truth is that all, then grown-ups. There's something else going on there to do with those kinds of utterances. So, and if you're interested in experimental work on pragmatics, I've put a few sources on there. I've just put the book covers, but hopefully you can find them easily enough. Because one of the reasons I wanted to mention these things was to show that it's actually relatively easy to do studies that will find things out about pragmatics. So that question I asked you, I've now got results from about 24 responses showing that the majority of people were not sure that sum makes sense when all the squares are blue. And then of course you can do that with different kinds of contexts, different kinds of examples, different kinds of participants and so on. Okay, now I want to move on to this example. What is this speaker communicating? And of course, there's no way for you to know because you don't know what the word tigged means. There wasn't anybody, did any of you know what TIG means? When I mention this to students in the UK, usually there are a few who know it, depending on where in the UK they're from.
Is it like a regional word or something?
Pardon?
Is it like a regional word or something?
It's not an original word, no. It's related to a game. So it's in other parts of the country, they would say tagged. And where I come from, I would say I'm Imani, which means the man. So it's when you play a playground game and you touch somebody, they've been tigged. The game where you run about trying to touch each other.
Mm-hmm.
So of course you can't have any idea what this person could have meant. But what I often find is people think they're going to be implicating something. There must be something, maybe they can't do something because they've been tigged and so on. And then I thought, well, I give you a little bit of context. Somebody says, come in, please. And the reply is, I've been tigged. Now you can begin to guess what it is, can't you? Okay, and I'm going to actually show you. I'm going to, again, demonstrate my uselessness at sharing screens and so on. But hopefully I'm a bit faster with this one. So I'm going to show you a scene from a movie now. Are you all seeing nativity? Yeah. So to give you a little bit of context, we're in a school in the UK and a teacher is about to return to his primary school classroom and meet somebody he hasn't met before who's there in the classroom.
Oh yeah, Mr. Bobby? Yes, what are you doing, Mr. Bobby? Oh, I'm your teaching assistant. Remember, please try and keep it neat. Dan, you having a bit of trouble there? Are you getting on, Fraser? No, you don't have to put your hands up. Just don't try it. I just thought we're supposed to be doing it. Yeah, we are going to just feels like everyone's just sitting around. This is the rehearsal for the play. This is still a creative writing class. It's a different thing. Who wants to do a play? Excuse me. Just move the tables. I didn't. No, you keep the tables back. Alfie, TJ, put the tables back. The next person to move their table will be in detention for the entire term. Come in, please. Come in now. Mr. Poppy. I've been told. Come in now. Get inside, please. I've told you before. Get in. Go in.
Okay, so now you've got a lot more of a sense of what was going on. I'm wondering if now you will tell me something different about what I've been tigged means. Somebody want to suggest something?
I'm trying to say this, but The video was a little choppy. We couldn't hear the audio at certain times.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, that's a shame. Okay, so let me try to tell you what was going on. So this Mr. Poppy is a teaching assistant, but he's clearly an overgrown child. He's not acting like a teacher. He wants to disrupt things and put on a play. The film is about putting on a play, a nativity play. And he runs out into the playground at playtime, and the teacher comes out and shouts at him, "Mr. Poppy, come in, please." And he gets the reply, "I've been tigged." Okay, and I'll show you. This is what he looks like as he says, "I've been tigged." So I don't know, does that help you to get a sense of what he is communicating?
Does it mean that he can't move? Like in a game, when you are tagged, you can't move until you're waiting for somebody.
Yeah, that's right. So what he's saying is, I can't come inside because I've been tigged. Okay. When I talk to kids about it, there are different versions of this game. And the game that this makes me think of is called Stick in the Mud, where in fact you should stand with your legs apart and you can't move until somebody crawls through your legs. I think these kids are playing a slightly different version. And now I want to ask you something else, which is, once you've understood that this person is saying, I can't come in because I've been tigged, how do you understand it? What is it that helps you to understand what's being communicated here? And I've realized that time is moving past quickly, so shout out if you've got some thoughts.
It's mostly use of the gestures.
Yeah, okay, so there's things like gestures and so on. So the key thing I want to point out here is it's not just the words, it's the way that somebody says something. And if you'd been able to hear well, you would see that he said, I've been tigged twice. So the guy calls out, Mr. Poppy, come in, please. And he says, I've been tigged. And then he shouts again, come inside. And Mr. Poppy responds by saying, I've been tigged. And there's a difference in stance. The first time he's standing like that. The second time he's standing like that. And the first time he says, I've been tigged. I mean, I'm trying to copy it. It's obviously not identical. I've been tigged, but the second time it's, I've been tigged. So the second time the prosody is implicating certain things. And what I want to do now is to, I hope that's enough for you to follow the next bit. So I put a slide with them next to each other so you could compare. And usually what happens when I talk about this with students, we talk about all sorts of things that have helped us to understand what's going on. And we move on to some things that are important to notice. One thing to notice is it's not just words that are involved in communicating. It's not just the fact that he said, I've been tigged. It's where he said it and how he said it and so on. Gesture, his eyes change and his body, he hunches over and he makes his body tense the second time and so on. And he moves his hands a little bit as well. That we need to think about when we're talking about what I've been tigged means in this context. It's not just Mr. Poppy meaning that he can't come inside. The filmmakers are communicating things to us. So we are understanding things about these people by watching how they behave. And I usually ask my students at this point how they think this film will end. And it's amazing how close they are to what actually happens. And I'll just tell you what happens. Mr. Poppy is the overgrown child. Mr. Maddens is the very sad teacher whose girlfriend left him and went off to Hollywood. And he is a guy who went through drama school and is now teaching in a primary school. And my students recognize quite quickly, Mr. Maddens will have changed by the end of the film and he will recognize he should be a bit more fun. And that happens. Also, it's not just communicating one thing. He's not just communicating, I can't come inside because I've been tigged. He's also communicating a bunch of other things. Like you are a boring person. You don't seem to understand the rules of the game. This game is more important than me coming inside and so on and so on. And also that it contributes to a fuller understanding of the film. So this scene is something that we're going to be thinking about later as we're watching the film. We're going to remember what Mr. Poppy's like and so on. Okay, I put a few sources there if you're interested in pragmatics and haven't done much about it before. There are lots of really good introductions to pragmatics, but these three are very good. The one in the middle, Jenny Thomas's book, is from quite a long time ago. It's like 30 years old, but it's still useful and full of really good examples. Okay, what I want to do, because I want to stop it with time for you to ask me a load of questions at the end, hopefully. Pragmatics is about how we communicate in context. This is where I'm going on to talking about how pragmatics has changed over the years. Nowadays, people think of it as about how we communicate in context, but it's also about everything involved in the construction of meanings, not just words. It also sees meaning as interaction. So it's not seen as Billy said something and therefore communicated something, and then somebody else replied and they communicated something. It's that we interact together and we create our meanings together. And creating the meanings extends over space and time. So all through the time we're talking to each other, we're adjusting our understanding of meanings, and even beyond. After we've had a conversation, I might still be interpreting what we said later on. Early pragmatics, which really developed from the work of Paul Grice, who, as I will tend to say to my students, is the first person who said anything that would help to explain how we mean things differently in different contexts. Even though people had noticed in ancient Greece, Aristotle spoke about how if you say something on Wednesday, it means something different from if you say it on Saturday. But nobody had any idea how that happens until Grice came along with some ideas. But Grice's ideas, or the work of people building on Grice, focused mainly on words and on fairly simple exchanges, and focused on how things are understood more than how people communicate. So this is a kind of explanation that a Gricean account might give. Mr. Maddens has said, come inside, please. Mr. Poppy has replied, I've been tigged. Mr. Poppy has said that Mr. Poppy has been tigged, and Mr. Poppy is implicating that he can't come inside because he's been tigged. And those of you who've done some pragmatics might recognize this kind of setup for explaining something in pragmatics. And so how do these early pragmatic theories explain it? Well, they tend to suggest that you get implicatures like this because we assume that utterances are going to be informative and relevant and so on. So in a context where somebody has asked you to come inside and you say something in response, it must be relevant to the request to come inside. So even if you don't know what tigged means, you're probably likely to work out this person must be implicating that they can't do what I've asked them to do. That's the kind of Gricean account. And then I want to ask what's wrong with these kinds of explanations. And what I would say is they underestimate how much pragmatics is involved in understanding things. They ignore nonverbal things. They oversimplify about what's communicated and the timescale of what's communicated. And they say very little about production of utterances or interaction. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm moving a wee bit quick here because I want to get onto the bits about writing at the end. So please stop me as soon as I move too quick or anything doesn't make sense. So I'm going to say something about some of these things now. So Grice's big ideas were, here's an idea for how we sometimes mean more than we say. Pragmatic principles explain this, and he suggested his maxims, which were along the lines of be relevant, be informative, and so on. And these are seen as ultimately rational. So there's a kind of reasoning behind how we work out what people mean. And if we take a straightforward example, like somebody says, coffee would keep me awake, a Gricean account would say that that speaker is saying, supposing it's me, that drinking coffee would keep me awake for the next few hours. And if I say it at bedtime, and you know that I want a good night's sleep, you'll see that I implicate I don't want coffee. And what I want to point out is that Grice said pretty much nothing about how we work out that when Billy says coffee, he means drinking coffee, rather than the color, the flavor, and so on. That he's talking about me being himself, and that he means for the next few hours. But pragmatic principles must be involved in that, and you could use the Gricean ones to say, well, it wouldn't be relevant unless that's what he meant. So what is said is worked out by pragmatics as well. And once you've recognized that, there's all sorts of interesting stuff in understanding what people have said. If somebody says it's too hot, pragmatic principles will help you to work out what it refers to and what sense of hot is intended. Is the weather too high a temperature for me to play tennis with you? Or is this food I'm eating too spicy for me to eat it? You're not going to die is an example that's been discussed a lot. If a grown-up says that to a child who's just cut their finger, the child does not think, I am going to live forever. They think, I'm not going to die as a result of this cut that I've got here. So pragmatics is about those kinds of things. And the third example, he was upset, but he wasn't upset, comes from a court case where O.J. Simpson was charged with murdering his partner. And as part of the trial, one of the witnesses was asked whether O.J. Simpson seemed upset at a particular time on that day. And the reply was, he was upset, but he wasn't upset. And what that was perfectly clear in the context. It meant he seemed like an upset person, but he didn't seem like the kind of upset person who was murderously upset. Okay. And this is an advert that's on the London Underground at the moment. I just spotted it the other day. So there's an advert for the London Underground, and the destination on the tube side there is going out. And that is playing on the idea that when we say I'm going out, it could mean more than one thing. And this is about, let's use my tube card to go out. So a different kind of out from just going out. And that's something that there's been a lot of research on in recent years, how words change their meaning in contexts. Okay, it's 9:10, so I am going to skip my little explanation of relevance theory. I'm sorry about that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to get onto these particular aspects of it. One of the ideas that relevance theory has is that when we're trying to communicate something, our intentions can be more or less clear. It might not be obvious even to ourselves exactly what we're trying to communicate, and that implicatures can be stronger or weaker. So if Mr. Poppy says, I've been tigged, he very definitely means he can't come inside. It's not so clear that he thinks Mr. Maddens is boring, but there's some evidence for it. And another thing is that not everything that logically follows from what we say is an implicature. So if I said to you in a classroom, here are some features of relevance theory, it would follow from me having said that I'm alive and that I'm breathing and that I can speak and that the class is still going on and so on and so on. But none of those things would be things that somebody would think I'm trying to communicate. In a different context, I don't know if any of you know this film, The Jungle Book, but I'm going to describe this scene. Towards the end of this movie, Baloo the bear has had a fight with a terrifying tiger called Shere Khan to try to protect the little boy Mowgli. And Bagheera, the panther, and Mowgli both think that Baloo is dead. And Bagheera makes a speech about how noble it is that this person has laid down his life for somebody. And as we watch the film, Baloo looks up and says, he's cracking me up. At this point, Baloo is communicating that he's alive, or the filmmakers are communicating that Baloo is alive. So when I say, here are some features of relevance theory, you wouldn't think I'm trying to tell you I'm alive. But in this scene, you do think the filmmakers are trying to tell you that Baloo is alive. So anything we say has a vast number of possible implications, but understanding what somebody says means picking out the ones that are being communicated. And what I want to suggest is that when we take this kind of point of view, we can think about, try to think of which slide I want to use now. We can think about communication, not so much as about communicating one proposition or not, but about adjusting how strongly we believe a whole bunch of things. And I think on this approach, we can extend this to a whole bunch of things. One thing I've been working on recently is the production of communication. So this is a paper that I worked on with my PhD student, Kyu Hyun Park, whose PhD is on this, on how, as we're producing utterances, we're making inferences about other people and what they will think of what we're saying. This was the slide I was looking for a minute ago. A key idea in relevance theory, communication isn't just about communicating assumptions or not. It's about adjusting the manifestness of assumptions. And an assumption is manifest to an individual at a given time to the extent that the individual is capable of entertaining it as true or probably true. And this is a complicated idea. And I think that's why it's not been used as much as I think it should be in explaining communication. So once you start thinking about this, it leaves you open to think about some very subtle kinds of adjustments. And here are some things that might or might not be manifest to you just now. So Billy is talking about pragmatics. I assume that's manifest to you. You're capable of entertaining that and thinking it's true. Billy's in the UK. Billy's in Newcastle. I've deliberately picked things where I think the first one, all of you will be thinking at the minute, or would have been before the slide came up. The second one, probably. The third one, I don't think we mentioned Newcastle yet today, so you might not know that Northumbria University is in Newcastle.
Actually, I can tell by your accent.
Pardon?
I can tell by your accent.
Can you tell my accent?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. You know, I'm not actually from Newcastle. I'm actually from the northeast of Scotland.
Yeah.
I haven't got I haven't.
Somewhere up north.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because there are some similarities by how Newcastle people speak and how Scottish people speak, but they're also different. You might think Billy likes the film Nativity. I've given you some evidence for that because I picked that clip, and I don't know whether I did anything nonverbal to suggest it. What about Billy has never spoken to Paul Grice? What I would suggest is you will all assume that that's true now that you've seen it on the slide. So Grice died around 1990-ish, so it's not impossible for me to have met him, but I can tell you now I never have. But that's something that you might have been able to think before you saw this slide, but you're not thinking it until now. So manifestness, this notion of an assumption that you could entertain, includes things you've never entertained. So there are some things that are manifest you now that you're never going to think in your life. And once you think about that, you can use this idea in thinking about how Mr. Poppy's utterance has made it more likely. There are some things I'm more likely to think now than I would have been before he said anything. Okay, so I think these things are manifest to you just now. But I would suggest that film clip made a load of other things manifest to you. And because it's 9:15, I'm going to skip on and just say those things, if we think about this notion of manifestness and a wide range of assumptions being adjusted as you understand the film, it helps you to see how individual scenes of films contribute to the understanding of the film overall, and so on. Okay, so this view sees communication as subtle, involving ongoing adjustments to the manifestness of assumptions and extending over space and time. I can see Lucia switched her camera on, so it must be getting near time for me to stop. Okay. Oh, no. Okay. And I am going to stop quite soon, so hopefully there's time for some questions and things. We can apply these kinds of ideas in various kinds of clinical applications. So I've mentioned neurodiversity there. So autistic people, there's a lot of controversy about exactly what it means to be autistic, but for some autistic people, they perform on that Sally Ann test like very young kids. So there's something about mind reading that's relevant to autism. People who've had strokes is another example we could talk about. We can think about the development of cognition and communication. So how 1-year-olds are different from 3-year-olds and different from 8-year-olds and so on. We can think about applying it in understanding the evolution of language and communication. So how did humans develop language? And some people think our pragmatic competences must have developed first, and then language would follow, because we would have been communicating with each other, not using language before we developed language. Understanding identity or identities, which is something I've worked on. And I'm going to show you a paper on that in a minute. And the thing I want to end on is on speaking and writing practice. So this is a paper I wrote about identity inferences. And the idea here was, I actually teach a module on identity to foundation year students at the minute. So we talk a lot about how identities are fluid, dynamic, constructed, change over time, and so on. And I think this idea that communication can involve very subtle adjustments in the manifestness of assumptions is very helpful in thinking about identities. So anything that any human does when they're interacting with somebody else contributes to constructions of identities, their own understanding of their identity, other people's, and so on. And some of the things about the way we behave are not about just saying, I can't come inside because I've been tigged, but they're about creating an impression of you as a certain kind of person and so on. And actually accent is part of that as well. So when people adjust their accent when they're talking to different people, they're doing things that are relevant to understanding identities as well. Okay, what I want to finish with is the speaking and writing thing. And I'm going to just talk very briefly about two kinds of writing. And the first is about sending emails. And I was actually talking to students yesterday, and I was telling them about an email exchange I'd had with a colleague. And I was asking them about how I would have worded the email and so on. And of course, if you are, these are foundation year students, so they're about 17, 18 years old, they're quite new to university. They've no idea how academics communicate with each other. And so they didn't know whether you start by writing Dear Billy, Hi, and so on. And I'm going to show you two emails. So we look at these kinds of things in class. And this is invented, it's not a real example, just to illustrate. So imagine me receiving this email. So it's addressed to Billy Clark, from Billy Clark, because it's an example. Apologies for next week's seminar. So I assume you would assume that was a typo. You just think Billy missed out the K. So again, your mind reading. Dear Billy, thank you for the seminar this week. I really enjoyed it. I'm afraid I can't be there next week because I have a medical appointment. I will look at materials online to catch up and let you know if I have any questions. Thanks and best wishes, Alex. When I show that to people, they go, yeah, it's a reasonable email, Billy. Sounds quite polite and so on and well-formed. And one of the things I also point out is it isn't asking me to do anything. And that's something that academics like. If you get an email and it doesn't involve a request for you to do something, that's also good. Contrast that with another one, which, and I do get emails like this sometimes, has no subject line, and with all the letters in the same lowercase, just says, hey, Billy, I won't be in the seminar next week. I've maybe exaggerated a bit. I maybe don't get ones as extreme as that. But when we talk to students about their professional communication, we're applying ideas from pragmatics. We're thinking about what would be in the mind of Billy when he receives this, what would be in the mind of Billy when he receives this, and notice that if you had a very crude idea of pragmatics, you might say, well, this is telling Billy that he won't be in the seminar next week. And this one is telling Billy that they won't be in the seminar next week. But there are all sorts of other things being made manifest here. This person has taken the trouble to think through how to formulate it and so on. They've put in something positive about the seminar at the beginning and on, whereas this person has literally just said, I won't be in the seminar next week. There's a lot more we could say on this. I want to end by, I wanted to mention student essays as well. We had an interesting discussion about mind reading and student essays. And I'm going to leave this as a question that we might talk about in a minute, rather than me trying to answer it or ask you to answer it now. We thought about how mind reading is involved in writing an essay. So when a student is writing an essay, my students will tell me, yes, I have to imagine the mind of the person reading it. And the question that we might come back to in a minute is, whose mind do you have to imagine when you are writing an essay for my module that you're about to submit? And I will just give you an indication that I'm also working on creative writing with a colleague called Tony Williams, who's a creative writer at Northumbria. And what we're doing in this project is we're thinking about how ideas from pragmatics might be helpful for creative writers to help them understand what they're doing when they're writing, including creative writers, at least in the UK, if they're employed by a university, they are not expected only to be producing creative writing and teaching creative writing, they're also expected to reflect on their practice. So when their research is assessed, they have to write reflections explaining what questions were you trying to answer by writing this poem. And Tony believes that some of the ideas from pragmatics could be very useful in explaining what writers are doing. So I don't think I've got time to get into this, but I'll just mention to you, there's a book by a writer called George Saunders, who's a very good writer, called A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, where he talks about stories by Russian writers who were writing around 1900, so people like Chekhov and Gogol and so on. He's got technical analyses of the text and he's got afterthoughts. And what you find when you look at this discussion is you will get some of his writing where he will say things like, Chekhov has chosen an unhappy woman resisting the charms of springtime. Why did Chekhov decide to do this? Let's try to see what Chekhov wants us to notice. So all of that makes it sound like Chekhov has made some explicit decisions because this is what he wants to happen to readers. But he also says, but did he do this intentionally? Was he aware that he was doing it? I think not. And he talks about Chekhov's instinct and an ability to do things naturally and stories unfolding intuitively. And so one of the things that we've got in mind here, sorry that I'm only giving you an indication, is that we're going to have to think, because the point of the project is that looking at what creative writers do, hopefully will help pragmatic theories. We're going to have to think about the sort of analytical, deliberative way of talking about writing and the more intuitive, emotional aspect. So writers will probably tell you, some of the things I do, I can't explain why I do it. I just have the feeling that these are the words I need to put down. And at that point, this is my summing up slide. So what I'm hoping has come across from all of this is pragmatics involves mind reading in a particular sense. So as I speak, I'm trying to imagine your mind. As you listen to me, you're trying to imagine what my mind intends. We do mind reading all the time. So I looked out my window earlier and I saw my neighbor walking past. I instantly started thinking about what he was doing. He was carrying some kind of tool. We're always thinking, what is that person doing? Pragmatics has developed considerably over the years. It's relatively easy to investigate. I didn't say this, but one of the things about pragmatics is because we're doing it all the time, the evidence for it is all around us. Every time we interact with somebody, we've got some data we can look at, and it's got lots of applications. And I'll stop there. Thanks. Obviously, I'm really happy if you've got loads of questions and things to talk about.
Thank you so much.
I'll stop sharing for now. I'll bring back slides if people ask me to.
I'll speak just through that. Billy, thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Amazing workshop. I will give the others some space to ask questions on the end, but it astonished me, or it's so astonishing for me to, even though I know about pragmatics, I have some background, but still, when listening to you, it was so astonishing to realize how our mind works, and we are able to decode those kind of secret messages for me. When you talked about the coffee, you had an example that it would keep me awake. I was thinking, so is it good? Do you want to stay awake? Like, do you need to work on and then to do some work, or is it that it's late and you don't want to talk? So I realized how it depends on the context, and that we are able to decode the context. So we are, our mind is somehow a supercomputer that can process everything in milliseconds, and we can evaluate the situation and react. So thank you so much. For my part, it was truly an amazing workshop, and I hope that our students have plenty of questions or reactions. So I'll give the other space to react. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. That coffee would keep me awake is often referred to for that particular reason, that it so much depends on the context you're in.
Now, I have to admit that this is a pretty intriguing experience. And not only that, but I would also like to pinpoint out another example, and that would be the phrase, it's quite good. Now, how would you perceive this phrase?
So, sorry, it's quite echoey, so I didn't completely hear. I'm hearing bits of what people say, but I didn't hear the key bit, which is the example.
Oh, I'm supposed to be talking into this thing, okay.
Oh yeah, it's actually clearer if you're there, yeah.
So,
What was the example? Try to say the example once again, the phrase.
okay, another example I'd like to point out is it's quite good. Now, how would you perceive this example?
Yeah, that's a really good example. Just to throw in about the thing about examples being everywhere. This is an example, isn't it? Because you have to turn your back to me for the sound to be good, but face me for me to see your face. And if I can see you, I get so much from it. But if, and it also at the very start, when I said I'm glad to be here, I made a little note. Isn't it interesting what here means in this context? Because I'm not in Slovakia. But it's quite good is a fascinating example for more than one reason. One is one of the things that particularly relevance theory thinks it does a very good job of is explaining those kinds of things where when somebody says something, it's a matter of degree. And somehow we have to get our minds to match so that what you mean by quite good is what I think you mean by quite good. And the relevance theoretic account of it, which I didn't go into the details of the theory, but they say that what we're doing when we're interacting is we're looking for cognitive effects. We're looking to understand what you mean, to get some conclusions, assumptions, and so on, without putting too much effort in. So if you say to me that something is quite good, what I have to do is I have to think, it must be good enough for it to be relevant for you to have said that. And so I will strengthen my idea about how good it is to the point where I think I get enough effects out of that. There's one slight issue there, which is different varieties of English use the word quite differently. And I once had to say to an American friend of mine who had commented on a workshop I had organized and said some of the talks were I think he said, let's say that he said the workshop was quite good. And I said, no, I need you to say it was fantastic. And that's because in British English, usually, quite good means, it's okay. Whereas in American English, quite good means really pretty good. So you do have a variation in English there that can be a bit problematic. But I think the thing that's interesting about pragmatics is that we're trying to explain, if you take the quite out and somebody said that talk was good, what you would do is you would kind of go for your average amount of goodness that talks have, and then you'd assume it was a bit better. Because once you've assumed it's a bit better, you get enough effects, but you wouldn't go assuming it was amazing. And I don't know whether it occurs to you, but that's similar to some and all. If somebody says some of these are blue, you think, well, if they were all blue, they would have said so. So I'm only going to assume a certain number of them are.
Yeah. Now, personally, I'm also leaning for the British example of quite good.
Right.
Because if I was to say this to someone, it would obviously mean that it's not good at all.
Oh, right. Okay. So it's even worse in your mind than it is in mine.
Even if most people would perceive it as pretty good.
Yeah. And there's also, of course, the details of the context you're in. So which thing you're talking about, how well the speaker and hearer know each other, how well they know the person whose quite goodness is being spoken about, and so on. So if we've got 30 students that we've been teaching together all semester, and then they all do presentations, and I say so-and-so's was quite good, it will depend on how I think that person's performance has generally been compared to the students overall, and so on. So the made-up examples are often a bit tricky because we don't have the full context to go with.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard, for your questions. Any other questions or comments?
Does anybody else have anything to say?
Yes. I would like to ask you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your great presentation, and I would like to ask you how to practice this kind of analysis, how to get better in it, and also is there something really important we need to know before we start this kind of analysis?
Are you just beginning to study pragmatics?
Well, not really, but I would like to get better in it,
Okay.
definitely. And I'm really interested in your process of this kind of analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I could actually talk for hours on this, so I'll try to rein myself in a bit. I mean, one thing I think is that if you are doing some kind of research, the more you're involved in a conversation, the better. So if somebody sets you a task of read a load of literature on pragmatics, it's a really hard task. But if somebody says, try to show that Billy Clark's analysis of how we make inferences about identity is wrong, now you've got a motivation for why you're reading those things, and you're on the lookout for something specific. And then you're in a conversation and it goes much better. So I guess I would skim. I always tell my students to look at lots of literature, but I also tell them don't read everything. Skim it, look at titles, look at abstracts, get a sense what people are saying, and look for the things that really interest you. And if you develop an agenda where it's on the lines of, like, one of my agendas is I used to teach pragmatics in what I think of as the old-fashioned way, where I would say, somebody has said this, they have implicated this. Let's not talk about the prosody and nonverbal stuff because that's too complicated. And then I realized that's really bad because so much of what's going on depends on the nonverbal stuff. So then I develop an agenda where I'm trying to understand, how does the nonverbal stuff work and how does it contribute? So I guess looking at existing analyses and seeing how you can improve them is probably the tip I would go for. To practice the analyses, I think it's as simple as every time you notice something interesting, try to work through exactly what's going on. So if I notice somebody saying, I'm pleased to be here, when they're only here in a virtual way, I think, well, what exactly is going on and how are people interpreting here? And then I will scribble down my analysis and then look at it and look at what the gaps are and think critically. I don't know, I could bang on for ages. I'm not sure I'm answering your question really.
Yes, I think yes. And I would also ask you another question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on.
But I would ask you about the connection between pragmatics and phonetics, and especially suprasegmental features in our communication.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I've got two only very partial answers. So one kind of answer is, within the relevance theoretic approach, if I make you go to a little bit more effort to process something, there must be some effects that follow that wouldn't follow from the less effortful version. So a classic kind of example is I bump into my colleague in the corridor at work and I say, hi, how are you? Like that, hi, how are you? They'll say, yeah, I'm fine. But if I say, hi, how are you? That sort of contrastive stress on the you is something that they notice. That's a little bit different. So now they're going to think something different from just, hi, how are you? So there's those kinds of things. Similarly, if somebody uses an unusual phoneme or says something in a particular way, that is going to lead to a different direction. My second answer is there's a fantastic book chapter that I would recommend to you. I will put it in the chat. It's in a collection. Hang on. I'll tell you, and you can email me if you can't find it. It's by Dan McIntyre, McIntyre, and Erica Gold. And it is called What the F***? So the F word is in the title. And what it is, it's a socio-phonetic, pragmatic analysis of a scene from the TV show The Wire. So there's a scene in that TV show where two detectives are going back over old cases and they're trying to check how they were investigated. And they go to a murder scene and they walk around looking at things, looking where bullet holes are, looking at where the window is and so on. And they pretty much only say the F word all through the scene. So I'm going to swear for a minute. They kind of go, fuck, fuckity, fuck, 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 and so on. Mother. They pretty much say the F word all through the scene. Importantly, there's a third character there who is the supervisor of the building, who's watching them and going, so that adds to our feeling as an audience of the implications we're getting from how they're behaving, which include things like they really know each other really well and they really understand what's going on and so on. But what's extra special about this paper by Dan McIntyre and Erica Gold is they analyze the phonetic features of it and they actually look at how that is different on different utterances of that F word and what that correlates with. So I would definitely recommend that chapter as a really good starting point for thinking about phonetics and pragmatics.
Actually, quite a coincidence since I literally watched that film about a week ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you, Andrea, for your questions. And now Ingrid raised her hand, so please feel free to ask questions.
Yes, thank you. I would also like to say thank you for this presentation. And my question is whether you're familiar with a card game called Dixit.
Dixit? No, I'm not.
No? Because I think that this game is also somehow heavily based on pragmatics. as the point is to, how to say it? Yeah, it's in this website that there's the storyteller, and then you have different type of cards, and it's for a group, and you're only allowed to say a single sentence or a single word. Of course, there are some different ways how to play it, and then everybody puts down one card that would mean the same to every single person. Okay. So let's say you say, that was a huge adventure for us. And then everyone puts down a card that somehow recalls this sentence to their minds. And this is also mainly about this mind reading, as you should think about the person's mind, because the point is to find the card that was the original from this author who had or who is leading that round, and to find that particular card that he or she described. So you really have to think with the other person's mind, and it's just somehow I just got this connection with this Dixit game and Pragmatics.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And it's interesting because it makes me think about different kinds of mind reading. Because one of the things about me is people always say, you got into Pragmatics, Billy, because you're so useless at it. So you always say the weird thing that nobody can follow, and you never get what somebody else is saying. Yeah. But I'm quite good at games like Dixit. So there's some aspects of mind reading that I'm quite good at, and others that I'm really weird, not so good at. There's also another piece of research I could mention by somebody called Nick Allott, Allott, and he has looked at game theory and how it relates to pragmatics. You know, game theory is about how your minds might coordinate or not, and you have to try to second guess what the other person's going to do and so on. So it seems quite relevant. And it would be interesting to do a pragmatic analysis of games, because there are lots of games like this, aren't there? Games where you draw something to try to get people to guess a word or phrase and so on. Yeah,
so that could be also like a very good title or for a bachelor thesis or for a doctoral to do this kind of research, games and connection to pragmatics.
Yeah, I think it would be a great research project. But it's also made me think about, in second language learning and teaching, there's been a lot of work on aptitude and different kinds of aptitudes for learning languages. There hasn't been so much on the different kinds of aptitudes involved in pragmatics and mind reading. And this conversation we just had has made me think, maybe we can pick apart some of the things that are involved in pragmatics a bit more.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you one more time for the lecture.
Thanks.
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, hello. I would like to also thank you for the presentation, for the answers that you have already given us. And I have a question related to second language studies. I was wondering, for example, as we have seen from the example about I've been tagged, a non-native speaker or even someone who simply does not understand the vocabulary, they would not be able to properly understand this utterance. And I was wondering, like, about your opinion, what do you think? Could a non-native speaker ever say for real that they are fluent in, for example, English as their second language? Because, for example, even if we do understand the vocabulary, even if we're confident in our vocabulary, there is still the question and the matter of background knowledge, cultural knowledge, high versus low context cultures, etc. So even if we understand the utterance like word by word, we may still not be able to recognize the pragmatic meaning behind it. So do you think it is possible for a non-native speaker to ever arrive at the level of the native speaker in terms of pragmatics?
I mean, the short, honest answer is I don't know. A couple of things I would suggest are, I think we often overestimate the fluency of first language speakers. So a lot of research that has compared first language pragmatics with second language seems to presuppose that the first language people all think the same things about things when they don't. So even that some of the squares are blue, not everybody responds in the same way, or somebody says something that's intended to be ironic, not everybody will respond as if it is ironic. I think there's surprisingly little research, I think. I mean, there's research on intercultural pragmatics, but that it often focuses on how to help people with specific aspects. So a lot of work on pragmatics and second language learning is about things like speech acts. How do you apologize? How do you request? And so on. But there isn't nearly enough, in my opinion, on pragmatics in general. I was teaching an MA module last semester, and some of the students were really interested in this, that, you know, just to think about the pragmatics of what's going on in the classroom and how we are communicating as teacher and learner in a classroom, but also the complexities of being a second language speaker in an actual context. So actually, a little example like I've been tagged, I think is a bit less problematic than the real life kinds of situations you're going to get into. Because if it's quite easy to use one word and people will work out, well, it must mean something like this. But if you're, I mean, having been in L2 contexts myself, I've often had conversations with somebody in a second language. French is the one I use most often, where I then talk to the French speaker who was also in the room afterwards to double check I actually understood what was going on. So I think what you've asked is a really, really good question. And I don't think I can give a straight answer except say it's really complicated, and I wish there was a lot more research on that topic.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Thanks.
Thank you to all. I'm afraid I'll have to close the session so we don't take any more of the precious time. I know he's teaching today, if I'm not mistaken, so let's give him as well some space. Thank you both so much, and I hope that you felt all right with us, that it was pleasant for you as well, that it was a good time with our students. We enjoyed it a lot here in the classroom. I can see that everyone was listening and not their heads. So thank you so much. I hope I'll see you again in other situations or when you'll have another opportunity. And after a short break, we will meet at 11, so in approximately 15 minutes, when Gisela will give her workshop on L2 speaking anxiety and speech once. Thank you once again. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy.
Bye.
All the
Bye.
best to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All the best to you.
Okay, goodbye.
We'll see each other at
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.